So take it away, Kathy.
Good afternoon, folks. If you don't mind giving me, if you know how to run that reactions button down there, can you all tell me, are any of you farmer vendors that are cottage food producers that also raise livestock for meat? If we have meat farmers on here, it's a different presentation, but if we don't have meat farmers on here, we don't need to bore you all with that information.
Or you can put it in the chat if that's easier.
Oh, thank you. Yep. Thanks, Joe. Then I'm going to make the assumption that you are all not meat producers. That saves us a lot of screens because wandering through those regulations is wowzer. Okay, I'm going to do that. Short version without meat. So we're getting the vegetarian vegan platform today, I guess. All right. Are you okay if I do that and leave my side panel up? Can you see that with enough, or do I need to make it bigger?
No, that's perfect. I had to do it as well, Kathy.
Okay, thank you. So Kathy Zeman here. I'm talking to you about an hour south of the Twin Cities in a little Wheeling Township in Rice County. Already have, 14, 15 baby lambs bouncing around out there. And pretty soon my puppy will start barking at us. So I'm just hoping we get through this okay without too many interruptions. So blazing trails through the jungle of local food regulations. We started this, I don't know how many years ago, mainly because we were all getting confused with all the different rules, right? Jane Jewett, the associate director at MISA, wrote the grant, looped in me and Brett Olson from Renewing the Countryside. And the three of us kind of tag team Blazing Trails. It typically is a 4-hour class, and it takes us through every single food product that we can possibly know about or think about selling in the local food shed. We did work with the local food advisory committee, LFAC, not AFLAC, but LFAC. It's a statewide group of people that gather together and talk about the rules quarterly. And then we also worked with the Department of Health, and we worked with the Department of Agriculture to make sure that everything that we talked about meshed up with what they know about the laws. So what are the topics we usually talk about? It's the landscape of everything from federal to state to local, the exclusions and exemptions, the jurisdiction differences between the regulatory authorities and where they intersect, what kind of license, if you get into licensing, what kind of issues that is MDA have, MDH, then the delegated authorities, and finally we end up with the food innovation team. And Shelley, I think, are you vice chair this year on that? No, you're going to be vice chair next year, I think.
No, I'm just on the committee.
Yeah, you're going to be vice chair next year.
I didn't hear that.
This year. I chair that this year. Shelley will have to help out next year. So what we're doing here in this presentation is just talking about the regulations. And I want to warn you, they're not intuitive. They're not going to be necessarily easy. You're not going to be able to say, oh yeah, that makes sense. There are a lot of times you're just going to memorize, because in the beginning, they were probably grounded in food safety, but since then they've kind of meandered around, and now they're buried in protecting business interests. But it doesn't matter. It still is what the law is today. And as the Minnesota Cottage Food Producers Association has proven, when we found laws that didn't work, you all helped fix them, right? And that's also an end result of this presentation, even though we're not necessarily going to talk about advocacy to change the laws. So we want you to be, so part of this will be increasing your awareness and of how, when to ask questions. But when you're done, you're not going to know everything. There's a lot to know. And every time I train this, and I think I've trained this now, 30, 40, 50 times, there are still things that will stump us as we go through it. There are a lot of reference materials available out on the MISA site, and that's called Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Ag. There's the link there. There's a lot as it pertains to product of the farm, and then how product of the farm intersects with cottage food. I should also say this training is not going to get you registered, right, to sell cottage foods. That's an entirely different training. This is more of the background information and how product of the farm, farmer food vendors, food farmer vendors can now intersect with cottage food. And again, remember that in Minnesota, we deal with federal regulations, tribal nation regulations, state and local. And then we deal with statute, which is law, and you cannot vary the law, but we also deal with the rule, and the rules you can vary. And that's what makes it really complicated when you start getting into delegated authorities and having 100 people look at the same word and interpreting that same word differently. This is all stored on this thing called the revisers on the web. This is great. As we go in and touch the safe food sampling law, or we go in and amend the cottage food law, we work with the revisers. They are the folks that write the law in their protocol. Like if some of you have ever written for newspapers, you know, there is the Associated Press style book. There's the Chicago style book. The revisers have their own style book. And so sometimes they reword our laws that we did not think of or would have thought of, but it doesn't matter. That's who it is. So when you get a law that you're amending or writing, you have to go back and make sure that what they did actually ends up with what we wanted. We always start here, and this is important whether you're a farmer or a cottage food producer. In Minnesota, we define the word food. And if we were meeting in person, we would have one of you read this out loud because no one can get through it without groaning or giggling. But food is literally means every ingredient used for, entering into the consumption of, or used or intended for use in the preparation of food, drink, confectionery, or condiment for humans or other animals, whether simple, mixed, or compound, and articles used as components of these ingredients, period. That stood in place for decades and decades until last year, when in order to get THC edibles approved in Minnesota, this is kind of the workaround to get around the FDA, they inserted the red words, except that edible cannabinoid products as defined in section 151.72, subdivision 1, paragraph C, are not food, despite the fact that they would fit the black ink up there on the top of that paragraph, except in order to get it legal in Minnesota last year, that's what they had to put in there. So even though they're not food, they would fit every ingredient that you stick in your mouth. And in order to make THC edibles, you have to use only approved source food ingredients, even though they're not food. I'm assuming as we are training our farmers market vendors, I'm sure this law is going to get amended this year and we'll have something new to work with in August. And this is just that little background about the THC edible law. It is 151.72. We don't have any food laws, any edible laws in 151.72. And that's because nobody in the food part of the state government is in charge of it. It goes to the Board of Pharmacy. And so there's definitions and scopes. FYI, our working plan to allow THC edible vendors at farmers markets is to be very cautious. I'm not sure any of our insurance will hold it yet. We're not sure how any vendor could get this through. And of course, remember, because it's not food, it does not pertain to cottage food producers, because cottage food is food and this is not food. But we wanted to put it in there just because it was new in 2022. And we'll talk about it, I'm sure, in 2023. Also defined in law, because this just tripped up about half a dozen markets in my backyard. Always good when my backyard farmers markets have issues. But we also define the word sell in law. This has come up often on the cottage food producers Facebook page. So sell or sale means keeping, offering, or exposing for sale, use, transporting, transferring, negotiating, soliciting, or exchanging food. Having in possession with intent to sell, use, transport, negotiate, solicit, or exchange food, storing, manufacturing, producing, processing, packing, and holding a food for sale, dispensing or giving food, or supplying or applying food in the conduct of any food operation, or carrying food in aid of traffic and food, whether done or permitted in person or through others. In other words, food is everything, every ingredient involved in anything humans or pets will eat or drink, except those THC edibles. And a sale or to sell or a sale of food is any time food changes hands in any way, unless it's private, unless this is something. So is the sand that your 2-year-old picks up out of the sandbox and sticks in her mouth food? No. even though that actually is something that goes in a human's mouth. And that would not be a sale either, because that is completely private. As you're passing around food at the dinner table, saying, please pass the mashed potatoes, again, that would not be a sale or sell. But anytime it's in that public realm, it is going to be defined as food and sell or sale. And that's why when we sometimes hear, oh, we're just going to donate it or barter it, it's still a sale. And therefore, it comes under the laws as set forth in the statutes or rule. So other definitions that are in law, and again, here on the bottom, we tell you where to go find them. And we'll be able to PDF this and get this to Jen and Shelley to put on the website. So a person is defined in law in Minnesota, any individual, firm, partnership, co-op, society, blah, blah, blah. And then an individual is an actual flesh and blood human being. So it is critical when we're writing law that we know whether we said the word person or whether we said the word individual. Here are other things that you hear in the law, in the rules, in the law, but that are not necessarily defined. So this is a term that you find in 28A.03 subdivision 11. Regularly engaged in a food business means any person, not individual, persons, that means all those corps and co-ops and blah, blah, who operates a food business over a period of time at uniform, consistent intervals. That's not well defined, right? So MDAs, since it's in 28A, we know that this is an MDA interpretation. Their working guidance here, since it's not defined in law, if you are going to sell, for instance, cakes more than 4 times a year-ish, then they will say, yep, you are regularly engaged in that. And then that means you'll have to come in under an exemption or an exclusion or a license. If it's less than that, they'll probably say, nah, you're only selling a cake every once in a while. You don't have to get a cottage food exemption. But it's that over 4 times a year-ish, again, gray area in the law. Other phrases that are not defined in Minnesota statute, all with cottage food producer implications, the end consumer or the ultimate consumer, not defined. Community event, another awkward one, not defined. And point of sale is actually not defined. So where is the point is, but we include these words in laws. And so where do we, so this is all gray area and it leads to multiple interpretations and a lot of patience, whether you're on the, whichever end of that sentence you're on, it requires patience. Okay. When we talk about food regulations in Minnesota, you're going to see some abbreviations pop up. The CFR, you'll see a lot with the canned goods code. That stands for Code of Federal Regulations. You will see the initials current good manufacturing practices. Always makes me laugh because honestly, we're not going to be looking at the past ones and we don't know what the future ones are. So why we call them current, I don't know. But this refers to the standards of the facilities that you will need in order to do certain cooking or baking or food things. And that's all driven by the menu. So if you're doing something that's pretty low risk, you're going to have a ceiling over. It could even be a tent or a canopy. But if you're working with food that is really highly potentially hazardous, then you will have to have walls and, sanitizable walls and ceilings and floors and equipment. PMO, since we don't have any meat or livestock farmers on, PMO stands for the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, and that drives everything to do with dairy. That's why there's no wiggle room, very little wiggle room for the dairy industry to be modified at the state level. It's all federal driven. Here are some more terms that we will deal with. It's often called an approved or approved source of food, and that comes in Minnesota Rule 4626. This is a good one to remember, folks. That number, you can look them up. When you're searching for something to do, someday when you're bored, just go out and wander around the reviser's site. But that approved or approved source means that food can be used as an ingredient in the public food system. So raw milk, unless it's aged cheese, is in Minnesota would not be legal as an approved source. If it's licensed And so a raw cheese under license, 90 days, that you could do, but this is not. Unless there's one exemption in law, which we're going to get to, that lets you do raw milk. But otherwise, approved source is pretty critical here. So I'm a meat farmer. I raise livestock, and I use a custom exempt meat plant. And that means that when I butcher a rabbit at my meat plant, because it's custom exempt, it is not an approved source. So even though restaurants will reach out to me and say, hey, can I buy rabbit from you to serve in our restaurant? I have to say, no, you can't, because it didn't get butchered in an inspected plant, and therefore it's not an approved source. So as you cottage food folks, as you start looking to maybe going into a brick and mortar or license, that'll come to play as well. So for instance, cottage food is not an approved source, right? Because you can only sell to the individual consumer. You couldn't sell it into that public licensed world. These are two terms. I know the definitions, but in reality, they are pretty much the same. An exemption means you can do something exempted from licensing as long as you follow the things that we told you to in the law. So cottage food is an exemption. Exclusion just means we decided to carve it out of statute. It doesn't matter what everything else says. You don't have to, you are excluded from licensing, and that is product of the farm. Pretty much the same, but tiny little differences in the way they use the term. So there are federal laws. This is how oftentimes our farmer food vendors scream like, these new food laws are driving us crazy. Yeah, 1906. These are old laws. That's because way back then, right in the beginning, somebody got sick or got sick enough, or people died, right, because of poor food safety. And so then the FDA came into it, and then the meat inspection plant came, and then the poultry products. And just FYI, poultry and rabbit are treated much differently than the red meats. They're just different laws, different limitations, different requirements. Won't go into that today because none of you are meat farmers like I am, but just know that they're just treated differently. But those are pretty old laws. The PMO Act went into place in 1924. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, so all of you doing body care products, that 1938. And then really nothing happened until 2011, when we had enough foodborne illnesses breaking out with produce that finally we said, maybe we better get produce underneath here. And that's the Food Safety Modernization Act, that all your produce farmers that are in as cottage food producers have to follow. Of the FSMA Act, there are 7 parts. We usually talk about produce safety, and then the preventative controls for human food. The other ones we wouldn't necessarily talk about. And tied into all of that is food traceability. Many times there's not a legal requirement for food traceability, but it's not a bad idea for many, whether you're a farmer or a cottage food producer, just to keep track of where did that food come from and where is it going. They always talk about traceability, one step back, one step forward. So where did I get that food ingredient and who did I send out the door to? Just in case there's ever an issue. If you keep if the need is high enough and the risk is high enough, if you can have those records in place and something happens, that kind of limits what the regulatory and enforcing agencies can look at. So for instance, if I say these carrots came from field 22, row 55, and I sold them to this co-op and something happened to those carrots, the people can come in and look at that field and that row, but they couldn't look at the whole farm and everything else that I'm doing. Unless it's connected and then there's a problem, but it just kind of limits your damage. So helps a little bit on liability. And if you want to know really how old these rules are and how ornery we the people got, back in 1907, Wheeler Macmillan wrote this poem in 1907, complaining about how a farmer is complaining about all of the food regulations. So just to put that out there, these are not new rules, these are old rules. Okay, so I need a chat now or a hands up or somebody. I need to know how many of you are also food farmers Because if you're not a food farmer, we can skip some of these and I'll touch on them, but won't go in depth. So how many of you are also produce farmers that are doing cottage foods? And Jen and Shelley, if you can help me grab those.
Yep, if you want to put it in the chat, I'm watching right now. Or here's one that. Looks like one person has raised their hand so far, maybe. Yeah, Cindy Hale. She raised her hand.
And then how many would be honey? How many are, we've already said no meat farmers. Any
You got-
egg farmers?
You got 6 people in the chat
There's
Okay,
another one.
and 2
Kelly
people
Hawes.
raised their hand.
that's good. You use that. Good job.
Robert,
Okay.
Joy. Oh,
Okay.
Joy's a meat farmer.
Joy, you and I might just want to talk off, or remember, we're offering this again. And if you're a member, you get to come free. So you can jump on this exact same thing and we'll do it with me in February and in March as well. So hang in there.
Yep, and Joy is a member, so.
Okay. Okay, that helps me. So federal law, USDA is in charge of meat, poultry, and eggs. Minnesota can be stricter than the USDA, but not less strict. And in Minnesota, we are stricter for these things, the amenable farm-raised game species. So we're talking rabbit, poultry, bison, emu, there's a list. And then we allow fewer types of exemptions for on-farm poultry processing. Not going to go into those in detail because there's, except for Joy, maybe a few other, we'll go into those in another time. But so if you notice, this is USDA. So just like in Minnesota, we let the Department of Ag do some of the licensing and the Department of Health. At the federal level, USDA is in charge of meat, poultry, and eggs. But the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is in charge of fish, shellfish, snails, crickets, milk, all other food, unless a wholesale, not retail, wholesale food product contains more than 2% cooked or 3% raw meat. Then it's USDA, and you need an inspector present on every day of operations. So when I told you this isn't necessarily intuitive, that's what I mean. Sometimes you're just going to memorize the rules and then try to remember all of that. So you can imagine the poor food inspectors, right? So where does this come into play? If you were a cottage food producer, produce farmer, wanted to make, and this has happened, that's why they end up with the fit cases. They wanted to make, I should go into making, I want to be a brick and mortar now, get licensed, and I want to make a broth, and I want to stick some meat in there, like some chicken broth. Then, and it contains more than 2% cooked or 3% raw. Then while you're making the chicken broth, you have to have a food inspector in your kitchen the whole time. And that's why those costs go up a little bit. Okay. We're not going to go into detail on that. So here are other regulations. So there's state statutes, and you cannot vary a state statute. And I'm sorry, Cindy and Kelly, your hands are still up. Did you just forget to put them down, or do you have a question? Because I think there's a button that says lower. Okay, good job. I didn't know. Sorry. Okay. So state statute, there's no variances. You cannot vary what the law says, even though it's been tried. But really you can't. So there's no city or county municipality. The cottage food law is a law. You cannot vary that. The safe food sampling is a law. You cannot vary that. So it doesn't matter if you're a delegated authority or not. You cannot vary the law. But rules you can. And that's where it can get complicated, because the variances are allowed because the menu drives the requirements. So there might be 100 people that have the exact same license, because there's only 5 or 10 license categories. But in those licenses, you may have hundreds of different products. And because of the hundreds of different products, then you'll have different requirements. And that's why it always looks like, how come she gets to do that? Well, it's because she has a different menu than you do. And in Minnesota, the Minnesota rules are in 4626, called the Minnesota Food Code. Linda Prale from the Department of Health just let us know yesterday or the day before in our LFAC, our Local Food Advisory Committee, that the 2022 US federal food code is out. A state can choose to accept that code or they can modify it. We here in Minnesota modify it. So soon after ag and health look at it, and we are all supposed to go out and read that. Sure, I would need a lot of coffee to get that done. We will be pulling together people across the state, and we stakeholders will be on there. So I will be asked to serve on there. I am sure that the Minnesota Cottage Food Producers Association will be asked to have a rep on there, because what we decide in Minnesota will impact everything that we do on the food code. And then if food crosses a state line, well, FDA and USDA has a play in that. In Minnesota, we have 11 different tribal nations, and all of them have their own rules. And if their citizens want to sell in Minnesota at a farmer's market or directly to people, they not only have to follow their rules, but our rules, just like you would in a different state. There are plenty of gray areas there too. So usually when we're dealing with this, we take it slow and careful. There is a model ag and food code that many of the tribal nations follow. For the sovereign nations in Minnesota that follow that, it makes it a little bit easier for them to match up with MDA and MDH as they cross over from their sovereign nation into the greater Minnesota. If they don't, then it gets more complicated. There are also local ordinances, which can have variances. There's conditional use permits and there's zoning, and local always wins. So when we all work to get the cottage food law, really the big modification back in 2015, we had to put in, this is subject to local zoning, because if you don't, that law could never have gotten passed. We couldn't get it passed for the safe food sampling law because local zoning always wins. So whenever we make these big changes in law, then we always check with those groups so that we know that it would not harm them and that they could sign on with us. Now, there are some best practices, some trainings that we put on. For instance, the GAP, which is for produce only, good agricultural practices, that is not a requirement. That is a voluntary training for produce. And here's where we get into some of the nuts and bolts for us. There's a license and there's an inspection. And MDA has the legal authority to inspect and enforce. And those are written in those laws. MDH, the same thing. Just FYI, MDA, ag laws are all in 31, 28, 31, 34. And then MDH is all in 157. That's how, if you ever see that notification 157, you know you're in a health law and not an ag law. And they intersect weirdly in different places. And if you're a delegated authority underneath any of those, then that legal authority to inspect and enforce follows through to the delegated authorities. We have had a number, and this is all the big language, and it pretty much says, this language says that they can only enter, inspect, and enforce at reasonable times. And they have to limit what they're inspecting and enforcing to whatever that issue was. It's just not this broad thing. Have entities that have been inspected and had some kind of enforcement action taken on them, have they sued and tried to say, no, Department of Ag and Department of Health, you can't do this? That has happened, and every time the Department of Ag and the Department of Health have won. That this is such old law and so well written that in this case they've always won. So just so you know, if the law says they can inspect and enforce, then they can. To date, they've never lost that case, and it's come up in a lot of it has come up in the raw milk world. So here's the same thing in health. They've got their rules written in health. They can inspect, they can do the ordering. So what if you get an inspection, or you get somebody tells you can't do something and you don't agree with that, or you see someone else that is clearly in violation, right? You'll notice in my e-blast this week, for any of you that get our weekly e-blast, I have to remind farmers markets that no, you can't sell raw milk at a farmer's market. It's not legal. You would think in 2023 we would all know this, but apparently, nope, not yet. So, but if I didn't put that out there and help educate all of our people, then if I saw that as an individual, I can go on to MDA's site or MDH's site and say, hey, Kathy Zeman is not legal. She's doing XYZ. And I can sign my name or I can be anonymous. Have many of us sent in complaints to both ag and health? Yep. And I can tell you that they're somewhat slow in responding. Some of them have never been followed up on. And I am not sure why. Maybe they're short of resources, but if it's truly a food safety event, then I do pay attention to that and help try to get those compliance officers matched up with either that market or that individual, because if at the local level, if one of us messes up and we have an issue, we all messed up and had an issue, right? So it is in all of our benefit to make sure that we are food safe first. So this does touch cottage foods a lot. So even though we're really talking about the food laws, I just wanted to bring in a couple of slides on taxes and let you know that many cottage food items at farmers markets are taxable. And it all, and what threw everybody off in our group is that you can sell the jams and jellies that you buy in the grocery store are not taxable, but the jams and jellies that you, the cottage food producer, sell are taxable. Why is that? Because the law says whoever the person is that mixes the two or more ingredients together, that's where it gets taxed. So if I'm a licensed jam and jelly maker and I'm selling my jam and jelly to the grocery store does not have to gather tax. All they're doing is reselling that, right? They didn't mix the ingredients together. I did. And that's where the tax comes in. And we did a whole session on taxes. I think we still have it recorded on our website, but there's many now different PDFs on our site. And then actually you folks, Shelley and Jen started the document and we're borrowing it to help out our people. But they're just like we have the non-potentially hazardous foods list, right? That we use for guidance. We have a list of food products that we know, yep, we've been able to confirm with the Department of Revenue that these are taxable and then these are not taxable. And that is a guidance document. So use it knowing that it's not for sure. They list the foods that are taxable and not taxable, and that's all listed. We link it on our page, then we link out to the cottage food producers page so that it can be a tool to whoever needs it. What else is part of the landscape that we're not probably going to talk about today? Just so you know, there's no law in the state of Minnesota that makes any food person have insurance. Doesn't matter who you are. You could be a corp. You could be somebody selling illegally. It doesn't matter. There's no law that says you have to have insurance. Does everybody have insurance at the big level? Oh yeah, right. Everybody's going to have product liability insurance. Many of our cities, if you're a vendor selling at a farmer's market, will say, oh yeah, you have to have insurance. So again, a local entity could require you to have insurance, but there's no law. And again, we're not really going to touch on the different business structures, but there's plenty of information out there on what type of business structure to have. So we wouldn't talk about that today, even though it's part of the local landscape of food regulations. That's not part of today's talk. So here's your quiz. When were the first federal food laws enacted? You can shout them out or put them in the chat. When were those first federal food laws?
(1907).
Very good. The first one was 1906. Not bad. When was the most recent one? The most recent one that we know about?
2011.
2011, that FSMA one, Food Safety Modernization Act. Oh, I never told you what was the main reason for the original reason for pasteurizing milk. Cows got tuberculosis and passed it through to people. And that's why, then they figured out if we pasteurize it, it killed that bacterium. And that's why we all had to go to pasteurization. The problem that I see with that law, okay, I'm breaking my own rules here, folks. The problem I see with that law said how you had to pasteurize. And how you had to pasteurize is going to cost you $1 million. Because To pasteurize milk is literally holding milk at temp 145 for 30 minutes or 165 for 18 minutes. A monkey could do it, but because that particular law specified how you had to do it, it forces it into a, that a big business could do it and you no longer could really do it at your home level. Then that's unfortunate because that is actually a skill and a task that we could do. What is food? What did we say food was?
Anything you put in your mouth, with the exception of THC that goes in for human and animal consumption.
Good job. You got the THC. Nice job, Jen. Okay, and what food exchanges are not going to be considered a sale? What would not be a sale?
If it's a private transaction.
Yeah, right. You're passing the food around. Actually, we're going to talk about a couple of them. Potlucks are not sales, even though you're really serving food. And yeah, so, but anything else really is that. Blank screen means we could take a 2-minute break if you needed it, or we're going to continue.
I think we're good. We just came back from a long lunch.
Okay, perfect. So the next thing is, in order for food to be safe, does it have to be licensed? And if a food is licensed, does that mean it's automatically safe? And the answer is no, not at all. We have many licensed food products. I get the daily email from MDA and from the USDA that tells me about the food recalls from all of the licensed plants, right? So, and because you're not licensed, does that mean you're not safe? No, product of the farm is not licensed. Cottage food is not licensed and yet completely safe, right? So just because you're licensed doesn't mean it's safe. It all stems from the food safety practices that you and I put into place as we are producing that food. Okay, so we're going to talk about exclusions from licensing, and that's when we're going to get to the product of the farm. So the product of the farm is excluded from licensing, and that was written into in the Minnesota Constitution a long time ago, right? Minnesota became a state in May of 1858. It's in Article 13, Section 7. And so product of the farm says, if it is 100% product of your farm or garden that you are cultivate and occupy, not own, not rent, not lease, that you cultivate and occupy, your garden could be a 2-foot by 2-foot raised bed. That is still product of the farm. Excluded from licensing, you can sell it any place. You can sell it to a grocery store, hospital, school, farmer's market, your neighbor, doesn't matter. You do not need a license. It doesn't mean, however, that it can be adulterated food or it could be unsafe, because you always, in Minnesota and across the US, you always have to make sure that your food is safe and non-adulterated food. So best practices, remember, I will always say if it's a must, it's in the law. If I say it's a should, it means it's a good practice. So best practices to ensure safe, non-adulterated food. If you're a produce farmer, follow GAPS, the good ag practices. Go to Annalisa Holtberg's training. Follow your CGMPs for processing. So whatever you're going to do processing, whether it's chopping your cabbage and bagging it and selling it, fine, product of the farm, no license needed. Make sure that you're doing it in an adequate facility, not your private residence, and not used for personal activities, because that's where you'd cross over into non-approved and approved. So you just have to make sure that what you're doing will fit those requirements. If you want to look up what the heck are CGMPs, you would go to 21 CFR. Remember what CFR stood for? Code of Federal Registry. I could have made that up. CFR stands for something. I think it stands in one of the previous slides, so someone could go prove that me wrong. But 21 CFR 117, that's where you're going to see what that looks like, what the CGMPs are. So people can sell their own product from a farm or garden, occupied and cultivated by them with no license. It's okay if the land is rinsed or leased, no minimum size. You can sell anywhere as long as no off-farm ingredients can be added, right? So, and that means like none. So like the one cottage food producer that assured me that his barbecue sauce was 100% product of his farm. I'm like, how are you making barbecue sauce without salt? Well, yeah, Kathy, I throw a little bit of salt in. Do you raise salt on your farm, sir? Oh, yeah. So it's got to be 100%. So it can be all the herbs. Like many people raise everything you could put in salsa except that salt. So keep that in mind. If it's a And more interestingly, because I don't have a slide on it, which I want to talk about, produce farmers that have fruit and they want to make juice and they want to can their juice, that's 100% product of their farm. They can do that. If they're selling it wholesale, they will have to have a HACCP plan. No license needed, but a HACCP plan, even though that is because of the risk. And that's only if you're selling wholesale. If you're selling retail, you don't need a HACCP plan. I would argue that's not good policy, right? The food safety exists because of that product. If that product really needs a HACCP, you got to have a HACCP whether you're selling retail directly to your consumers or wholesale. But that's the way the law is written. And so that's what we teach. All right. So are mushrooms growing in your basement a product of the farm? Absolutely, they are. Here are all the different products of the farm. Meat with no added ingredients. So if I butcher one of my pigs and I'm selling the roast, the chops, no license needed, but the bacon, the smoked chop, those would all require a license. Poultry and rabbits with no added ingredients, shell, eggs, fish, all of these, fruit, veggie, edible flowers, cultivated mushrooms, herbs, nuts, grains, dry beans, honey, maple syrup, wild forage foods from your own property. These are all product of the farm, no license needed. The only thing really missing from that list is dairy, and dairy falls underneath PMO. You don't need a license to sell your milk, but you have to follow all these other facility and inspection requirements. So it feels like it's a license and it feels like it's many licenses, but it's not a license to sell your milk. So why are these items right here in blue? Because, well, except for Joy, well, any of you that really do sell meat will talk offline or you'll come to the other one with me. We add about 30 slides to this presentation because for these products alone, because the regulations for sale for these depend on who your buyer is and where you are selling. So it depends on who you're selling to and where you sell. Okay, that's really critical to know. So we'll just get even, eggs. If I sell eggs from my farm, Shelly, let's say Shelly comes to my farm, wants to buy 2 dozen eggs. I don't have to clean them. I don't have to grate them. I don't have to candle them. I don't have to put labeling on my egg carton. But if I'm going to go sell eggs yet today to my restaurant in town, which I am, I have to grade them, candle them, clean them, label them, deliver them at 45 degrees or less. That's the requirements. So depending on who your buyer is and where you're selling to, there's different requirements. Okay, more product of the farm. Keep this in mind because it may affect some of you sometime. If you're selling food that is frozen, but you have to keep it at frozen, state 0 or below. It can be 10 degrees or below if you're while in transport. If it's fresh, if you're selling fresh food that has to stay at temp, it's got to be 41 degrees and you have to date mark it. And then shell eggs always have to be 45 degrees. So at a farmer's market, when I see eggs sitting out on somebody's table, that's when I just say, oh, you're not going to be selling those today, right? They're just for display because the eggs that you're selling better be in a cooler on ice or in a plugged in refrigerator because they have to stay at temp. Okay. So let's talk about your wild forage foods. Wild mushrooms, again, I don't necessarily agree with this law. If you are selling wholesale for wild mushrooms, you have to go through a training. That training is not required if you're selling directly to individual end consumers like at a farmer's market, even though you'd be well advised to have that in place because that class that you're taking that MDA has approved does, it helps you identify the mushroom. Because remember, mushrooms can kill you, right? The wrong ones, the right ones. So wild mushrooms, that requirement is not there for farmed mushrooms, mainly because if you're farming your mushrooms, you were assuming you know what that spore was and you know you're growing a non-poisonous mushroom. Product of the farm includes all of the wild forage foods you're going to find on your farm that you own or rent. So that's all those edible, the seeds, that's all product of the farm, no license needed. If you are harvesting wild foods on land you don't own or rent, you do need a food handler license for the sale of those products because you just broke that product of the farm exclusion from licensing. If you're on public land or public waters, you may need a DNR permit or license. And however, tribal members who are wild harvesting on their own treaty authority land, they would not need their own. What about processed product of the farm? Now we're creeping closer to cottage food. Product of the farm can include processed fruits and vegetables. The word processed is not defined anywhere, which is awkward. There are two triggers, just keep this in mind, that end the product of the farm status of exclusion from licensing. If it's sold by someone other than the farmer who grew it, there's going to be an example coming up, or if you added any off-farm ingredients. Processing is never a trigger to require a license. You can clean, cut, chop, bag, freeze, thaw. None of that is a trigger to licensing. It has nothing to do with licensing, okay? Because this was actually written into some publications that both MDA and MDH put out, and they were wrong and they've been taken off. But interestingly, the MDA publication called Operational Guidelines for Vendors at Farmers Markets, which was the last time they actually published it was probably 15 years ago. I still found it on some cities' websites. And there's hardly anything in it that's legal anymore. So I'm just really I want you to pay attention to this. Processing is never a trigger to require a license. You may need an inspection. You may have to have a commercial grade facility. Sometimes you might need a food safety plan. Sometimes you might need HACCP, but it doesn't require a license. So making vegetables presentable for sale that is not processing, you can trim the roots, trim the tops, wash off soil, remove the outer husks or leaves. You do have to use potable water, you say it the way you want to. And that just means the water, it has to be safe to drink. You don't need a test necessarily. You have to make sure that it's potable or potable. So what is processing of fruits and vegetables that still is okay under product of the farm? You can peel them, you can shred them, you can dehydrate them, you can bag them, canning, fermenting. Those three you have to be careful because sometimes they require a food plan, sometimes they require HACCP because of the potential for botulism. But you can slice them, wrap them, freeze them, put them, wax them, treatment for ripening. All of that's fine under product of the farm, exclusion from licensing. And we have a fact sheet that talks you through all that. So farmers can do this with potable water, appropriate facilities. You can't do it in your kitchen in a private residence. And you have the appropriate processes. You're going to follow CGMPs. You can shred and bag cabbage, sell it to a hospital, a school, doesn't matter. A farmer could sell that to a cottage food producer. Peeled or sliced carrots, chunks of squash, frozen blueberries, frozen apple slices, frozen rhubarb chunks, all fine. It's product of the farm, no license needed. So any questions from you produce farmers on the call about those exclusions from licensing?
I have a question. So the bagging of lettuce, then you could not wash that in your own home kitchen is what you're saying?
Correct. That for product of the farm exclusion from licensing, that all needs to kind of happen in a packing shed. Could be in your garage. It's got to be set up outside of, yes, correct.
Okay, so as long as you're following regulations, then
Right.
it could be on your residence, but it cannot be in your home.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
correct. Yeah. And so a lot of folks, if you think about produce farmers, when they start out, not everybody has a fancy dancy packing shed, right? So they might have thrown a tent up and they might have put down some kind of, they might have walking on pallets, so they're not walking directly on the ground and then they've got a table up and you're washing and bagging out there. That would meet for that product would be okay. Because think about, you can't have too much water on the ground. You're going to be walking in mud, or you might have mud splash. And then eventually you get to your fancy dancy packing shed. Yep. So just really think through where you might have those problems about food safety issues. And if you're worried about that part of it, get to Annalisa's gap training. There's a couple more coming up. I'm not sure where you're located, but I'll get you that link on where those gap trainings are coming up. Because we need more produce farmers, just saying. All right. These two are actually products of the farm. You can make fermented kombucha and vinegar. If your kombucha has too much alcohol, it does come under the Department of Public Safety, and you'll have to gather tax on it. So that would require a DPS license and sales tax. It really requires you to control your process. That's the website for there. And you can see the fact sheet out there. You can product of the farm, no license needed. You can make mead, wine, beer, spirits. Again, the alcohol is regulated by the Department of Public Safety. There are fact sheets there. You may end up under the Federal Tax and Trade Bureau. So you can see why the license is probably one of your minor things to worry about, right? To on your checklist to be a good producer of food. These are all products of the farm: kombucha, herbal infusion or tea, fruit juice, vegetable juice, fruit veggie juice blends, wheatgrass juice. These may require special processes or wholesale sales. And HACCP stands for that hazard analysis and critical control points. It's a plan. So every place where you might have a hazard that could cause a foodborne illness, you have to have some kind of a plan written down how you will prevent that. So for mixed ingredient products, can I mix ingredients together? Sure, you could. A lot of people do. A lot of produce farmers do those the stew bags. They'll put in a plastic bag. They'll put in beets, carrots, potatoes, maybe onion. Onion goes a little bit faster. Maybe a black radish, a black Spanish radish. They put them all in a bag and call it a stew. That's all perfectly fine, legal without a license. What if you you really have a hard time growing potatoes and you want to put potatoes in there? And so you're going to buy potatoes from your neighbor. That requires a license because it's not 100% product of your farm or garden. Do we have a lot of CSAs that might be caught on that rule? Yep, we do. So it's what we just keep training. So sometimes on product of the farm, if you can't meet those CGMPs, you can't get it done under not in your home, then sometimes you're better off to use the cottage food exemption or use an off-farm ingredient and just get a license. I mean, those are options, and sometimes they're very good options. You're always responsible for the safety of your product that enters commerce. And so remember also that if other people mishandle the product after it leaves you, you may be held liable for injuries that may occur. So the moral of the story is make sure that you have a product liability insurance policy in place. Because even though you might have handled it perfectly, the next step over might not, and you would still be held liable. Traceability requirements don't apply to everything, but it's good practice. So, where did it come from and who'd you give it to? Put that in your records if you need to. So any more questions there? Otherwise, we're going to jump to some of the exclusions.
Kathy, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this correct. Basically, in a nutshell, in the urban area, you would have to live on the property and have that garden?
No.
Or can you do a community garden?
You can do a community garden. It's called Occupy and Cultivate.
Thank you. I missed that part. I had to answer somebody.
Yep, absolutely. That's just, community gardens are just fine. It's what you occupy and cultivate. It's just fine. Product of the farm. Interestingly, there are some NRCSs in other states that are saying, you know what, we'll actually call you a farmer and we could give you one of those free greenhouses, the free hoops. Minnesota, I'm not sure. I mean, I think we could force it, but I don't think it's there quite yet. But in Alaska, where they are all food, right? That is hard up there. They'll give free greenhouses to anybody that turns around that will grow food. So there's other exclusions. We're going to go through them rapidly. If you do occasional, there are 6 other exclusions from licensing and ag. Here's one of them. If you occasionally do cakes, less than 4 times a year, like for a bake sale, then you would not need a license. You're not going to need a license if your principal mode of business is not food handling. So if you're an Ace Hardware store and you want to sell some prepackaged candy or nuts, your principal mode of business isn't food, so you're excluded from licensing there. The next one that we're going to talk about is exemption from licensing in ag. That is the food sampling and demonstration. And that says that at a farmer's market or, once again, community events that's not defined, you can give samples or do a cooking demo with samples with no license. Jen, did you have a question?
Yeah, can you back up to that whole Ace Hardware thing for a second? Are you talking, so you're talking about a bag of nuts and that type of thing? Are you specifically talking about product of a farm or
No,
in general?
Product of the farm is one exclusion from licensing. This is another one. So in ag, there's 7, I think, exclusions from licensing. And under health, there's 15. So there's 20 some exclusions or exemptions from a license, because, certain industries like we would do, you and I went to the legislature and said, we don't think we need a license to have a food sample at a community event. We don't
Mhm.
think we need a license to do cottage food if we're doing non-potentially hazardous. So these folks came and said, why do we need a license? We're selling, chainsaws and nuts and bolts, and we want to sell prepackaged. These are all prepackaged, bottled or canned soft drinks. So they are also excluded from licensing under subdivision 7. Is that
Okay, because,
interesting?
I thought that they had to have a wholesaler's license at that point.
No, they don't. Not under ag. So there's like this one, if you're a bake sale, you're just excluded from licensing in these unique situations. Okay, so far, and I have what time does this session end? I'm going to make sure I don't go over.
2:30. You got an hour.
Perfect. Nice job. Okay. So food prior to 2014, if you wanted to sample food, cottage food, farm product of the farm food at a farmer's market and or a community event, you had to have a license. And the license was either for 10 days or 21 days. And and in that law, you had to have your hand washing station had to be mechanized. Okay, so none of that worked. And we found out at that time that there were many of the farmers markets in the metro area that were allowing their people to just have a 5-gallon thermos. And then those of us in outstate Minnesota said, how come they have a different law? Why is it different for them and not for us? And then we found out, no, it's the same law. They just weren't following it either because, as one person said, it was a really dumb law. So we sat down with Ag and Health. That was the first time that we kind of entered into this. Can we come up with the law? So we do have a law now. It's called it's 28A.151. It's the food sampling and demonstration law. It says that as long as you follow these particular things, you do not need a license. And you can do samples or cooking demos with samples with no license. And so it says you do not, the following requirements, you do have to follow the food safety requirements in Minnesota Rule 4626.1855. There's like 15 of them. And it says you have to have a canopy over. You have to have a pressurized warm water to wash your hands. You do not need pressurized hot water to do your ware washing. It's just a weird thing in the law. Your samples must be offered in single-use serving items. Prior to this, you could throw a whole bunch of apple slices on a plate and just let people take their apple slices off. Well, you can imagine, my little fat fingers picking up an apple slice and touching 3 or 4 other ones. And if I have germs on my hand, then that's going to be a problem. So they have to be single serving. Now you can do a toothpick in an apple slice, right? But you can't just pile them anymore. They have to be 3 ounces or less. That actually came from the legislators. We were all kind of laughing because no one wants to give away a lot of product. So it didn't need to be, but it's in there, 3 ounces or less. And you must have a hand washing station because you have to wash your hands. And that on a hot day in July, the hand washing stations can be as easy as what's on the left. In the law that we referenced, unfortunately, it says that it has to be warm water. So in July, what's on the left will work. You can imagine our outdoor November farmers markets. You will need to put warm water in that insulated thermos, and that would be your legal one for all year long. The left is legal for your warm months, but it's not legal for your cold months. And again, that really, both of those cost about $25. Most of the time you'll buy your thermos and then you'll have to spend another $5 to get that flip up spigot. Most of them come with the push button spigot. There's no way you can wash your hands adequately because you have to rub them together. And if one of your thumbs is pushing down the spout to get the water to run, there's no way to do it. So, and MFMA has a stash of them. So if anybody needs them, people call us and I mail them out to them because it's really important that if you need that hand washing station, you have to have that flip up spout or a turn one.
Hey, Kathy.
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to interject something that I found out recently. A lot of people, when we talk about the safe food sampling, the water hand washing stations, I think that they're needed, they're necessary for the customers. They don't realize they're for the vendors.
Yeah, it's for the vendors, correct.
Yeah,
During COVID, we put them out all over the place, right? Because we didn't, especially early on during COVID, no one really knew what was going on. And so we all put hand washing stations out wherever shoppers could enter. Not a lot of people really use them well. We do find that a lot of farmers markets are continuing that because just in case you have those emergencies, right? Like some kid, sneezed all over or somebody spilled something. They're just nice to have now. But yeah, they're for the vendor because the vendor's handling all that food. And remember when Suzanne Dreesen did that, early on, one of the early years, she tested, she did that glow in the dark germ, right? So first she washed her hands and then she put the gloves on and then we saw how much germs were on the gloves. And then the other time we did it, she didn't wash her hands. She just shoved the gloves on and then the glow in the dark. And those gloves were full of bacteria, full of germs because her hands were dirty when she put on the glove. So the process when we train this class is you wash your hands, then you put your gloves on. And you can wear the same gloves up until you do something to make them dirty, like handle money, or you drop a spoon on the ground and you pick that up, or you use your gloved hand to open your car door to go get more product. Those are all where you've now broken, right? That nice, clean, sanitized glove. Then you have to go take them off, wash your hands, and put your gloves back on. I say we should have always had these mandated for produce farmers or any farmer who shows up at a farmer's market. A lot of times, you show up and you've just harvested, right? And so you could have dirt on your hands and this way they could wash their hands and then be selling their produce. But at least for the safe food sampling law, the one on the right works all year long. The one on the left will work most of the year.
okay.
So this is where I'm going to break my rule. And we said we weren't going to do any advocacy. So we've got some inspectors already letting this happen, and I never think it's a good idea to have practice that doesn't match the law. So the proposed change that we would ask the legislature to make in this law is that you wouldn't have to have a hand washing station if your samples are packaged at home. So you're not doing anything on site, right? You're at home, you're in your home kitchen, you're washing your hands. So actually some of these examples came from the Minnesota Cottage Food Producers Facebook page. Remember when I asked okay, tell me what you're doing. So on the left, these are somebody's dehydrated candies, which every time I look at them, I want to eat them. So I would tell you, and I sent these pictures to some of the inspectors at Ag and Health. They're like, oh yeah, that would work, right? That's perfect. There's no reason you'd have to have a hand washing station. I think these are mats, maybe. Who does caramel corn, popcorn, those would be legal. This, if you did whatever you're doing in this little cup down here, that would be okay. Where I'm not, what do you think? Because we're going to have to hammer this out in the details. If you brought in your samples, like this would be an apple slice on a toothpick, could you put that tray underneath that domed cover? Would you consider that covered and packaged?
Well, are those apples, Kathy?
Yes, I know they look like bacon to me too. Did you think they were bacon?
No,
They're
because
apples
we
on
had this
caramel.
whole conversation with, and this is where it gets hairy because they're wooden sticks. As a cottage food producer, that would not be allowed at all because it's cut and stuff. There's caramel on it, it appears.
Yep.
So that's not allowed at all because we said at this time, because of a listeria outbreak back many years ago, that we are not allowing caramel apples.
Yep. But this would
And
still be, but this is
so
still
that
allowed.
actually wouldn't be allowed at all because there's a stick in it. It's been cut. We can't cut our fruits.
But it's not being sold, Jen. It's
Yes, so
a
this is-
sample that's been given away.
So
Okay, so can we sample something that we can't
yeah,
really
so the law,
do?
the law says that your cooking demo and samples can be anything that's a main ingredient that you sell. Right. So, and that would be on the vendor side. Now, if you were going to bring in a chef that wants to do a cooking demo, there's no limitation to what you're doing. So in this particular case, you couldn't sell them under cottage food, right? But these could be a licensed product. What if you're a licensed food producer, right?
That's what I'm saying. License, it works, but cottage food, I don't know that it would work because
So my question is, would we think about it just from a food safety perspective? If you had cut pieces on a tray, but underneath this domed, would you consider that packaged?
No.
Okay.
I don't.
What about the rest of you? I didn't either, but this is the one thing that came up, and you folks know more about it than I do. I mean, what's underneath that dome right now, I think, are slices of cake, which are not individual slices. So that wouldn't work. But that, you see this at grocery stores a lot, right? And that's why I worried, like, would you consider that packaged?
Anytime that you're going to actually have to physically handle it, you're going to need a hand washing.
Yeah, I would not consider it packaged, because for me, it's not only if you have to touch it, but if it's got exposure to the air. And so what I'm seeing with these other examples is they're all sealed.
Yeah.
And so the customers won't opening it up.
Right.
So yeah, I wouldn't consider that sealed.
And so maybe that's, as we work on the language in this amendment, maybe that's it, a sealed package, right? That would then, so no one could get confused, like, I know, but I covered it with the dome. Because during COVID, that covered dome worked. But this is different, right? We're no longer under COVID, and because you could do samples, but they had to be covered somehow. So I would not consider, okay, so we're kind of agreeing, right, folks? Everything on the right-hand side, there's really a big red X. We're not saying that's packaged. But these over here on the left, you'd be okay with those 3 green check marks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Pat wants you to explain a little bit more about bringing demos.
Yeah, so that the Safe Food Sampling Act says you can do food sampling and cooking demos at a farmer's market or a community event without licensing. So, and we have a lot of University of Minnesota Extension SNAP Ed folks come in, and they will wander around the market and they'll buy stuff from the vendors, and they bring it underneath their tent where they have their 3-bucket washware station, right? So you have to wash, rinse, sanitize, whatever. Right, you're all set up, and then they can chop all that up, make a salad, put dressing on it, and then they're going to take those samples and put them in little 3-ounce cups and hand those out. That is legal underneath this law. In that case, that cooking demo has to have a hand washing station, right? Because you didn't bring anything packaged. You could go buy a pound of burger from the meat vendor and add that in. You could get cheese from the cheese vendor. That all is legal underneath this law, underneath the requirements of this exemption from licensing as a cooking demo. That's all legal. There's no limitation on what the food is. And the goal there was, gosh, look at all that good food that's at a farmer's market. If we wanted people, well, because back then too, people were like, what's kale? So, okay, let's serve them a kale salad. Well, they might catch on then what kale is. But yeah, all that's legal. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Pat, does that answer your question? Yes.
Okay. Yep. So think about that as, and that would, so this will work at a farmer's market or a community event. Community event is still not well defined. Good luck to us all. Okay. All right. Thank you for that little feedback, because that'll be helpful going forward. So now we're going to talk about cottage food. And again, you've probably heard this from many different ways, so you'll be the most well-trained people in the world. But again, just remember that registration for MDA is required. Training is required. And it's either online or in person. There's are we still at the 7665 for this year, folks, for 2023?
So far.
Okay. Yeah, if you're in tier 1, you got that free annual registration, free annual training required. If you're in tier 2, it's 78,000 annual gross sales, $50 annual registration fee. That's annual, but the training's only required every 3 years. Extension, I think, is still offering that. Cindy Hale's on the line. She can weigh in on that if she wants to. Cottage food, now you can be an LLC or anything you want to. You are registering with MDA as an individual, but you can be an LLC or run it any way you want to. Whatever you decide is your business structure. You can only do potentially hazardous foods. That's pH of 4.6 or less, water activity of 8.5 or less, so very dry or high sugar. You must label each product with your name and address or your name and cottage food registration number. You must include an ingredient list and statement of any allergens on your product listed. I just see that sesame is now a new allergen.
That's correct.
Yeah. Your label on each product must include the words homemade and not subject to state inspection. No, you do not have to package and label at home. And no, you do not have to have a hand washing station on site if you package and label on site, but you must have a sign at your point of sale that says these products are homemade and not subject to state inspection. And that doesn't matter whether it's on your webpage, on your social media postings, at the front door, at the tent to your farmer's market, wherever your point of sale is, that's where that has to happen. And again, point of sale is not defined. So the key here, if you think about it, just so you know, just so your customers know that these products are homemade and not subject to inspection. That's really the intent there.
Hey, Kathy,
Yes.
can you back up to the previous slide and just go over that last bullet point again about
No.
packaging on site?
Yeah, so this is
Because I think there's a lot of confusion around that.
There is, and the day after the LFAC meeting, MDA let me know that they did update their website to correct their incorrectness on their website. So, because where they might have liked everybody to package at home, the law doesn't actually say that. And as long as the law doesn't say that, then we don't interpret things beyond what the law says. So, no, you don't have to package and label at home. You can do that on site. And no, you don't have to have a hand washing station on site if you package and label on site. The key here is, though, where it got really awkward, and this is where it got caught in some of the Minneapolis farmers markets. If you have a cottage food producer and in a booth right next to a licensed food vendor, the licensed food vendor, if she is packaging and labeling on site, she has to have a hand washing station. You could be doing the exact same things by law in your cottage food producer booth, and you don't have to. Really awkward, right? And so the food inspectors got confused. So we still have to go back to, so remember that this isn't an exemption, but then above all of this is that wording in 34A that says you can never sell anything that's adulterated, right? You always have to make sure that you're selling safe food. So in practicality, if you want to package and label things on site, would you maybe want to have a hand washing? Maybe, but it's not mandated. So as a cottage food producer, so where you see this a lot with cookies, right? Not everybody's going to stick a cookie in the individual package. That would be crazy. They'll bring them maybe 3 dozen cookies in a big container. You get to the farmer's market, you take the cover off that. Here are the 3 dozen cookies in your big container. The customer comes and says, I'll take 6 of those. So then you as the cottage food producer will have your gloves on or tongs. You'll pick those up. You'll put them in a bag. The bag has the label on it now, right? Because now you've got a package. But that would not mandate you to have a hand washing, but it gets really awkward on how you're going to do that and make sure that your hands or your tongs were clean. So even though the law doesn't say you have to, I don't know of a good way to accomplish food safety, right? And not do something there. What do you think? But the law does not require it. And that's where Minneapolis got in trouble. Their inspectors were telling people they had to, but that's not what the law says. And no one is allowed to make up the law. Because if that's the case, I could make up a lot of really cool things. I'm really creative, super creative. And I would just give you, let me do it, right? But you can't, it's the law. And so if there's a problem with the law, then let's go touch it, right? But if not, then, we cannot make up stuff. Maybe no one can, it's just, you can't. All right, is that okay, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, that works for me as an answer.
So we
It doesn't make sense to me in general, but as an answer, that's perfect. Thank you.
So MDA site is now correct. Minneapolis's site, I haven't gone back and checked, but their site was 10 years out of date. So they've got a little bit of cleanup to do there. They still refer to it as the pickle bill in subdivision 9 and 10, which has not been in effect since 2015. Okay. So here's really the big difference between cottage food and licensed food. Cottage food, you can make it in your home kitchen. Licensed, you got to do it in a licensed commercial grade kitchen, not your private residence kitchen. You have a sales cap in cottage food. There's no sales cap in licensed, right? You can do whatever you want to. Cottage food, all sales are only to individual consumers. There's no, you can, if you're licensed, you can sell anywhere, right? Whatever your license says you can. And then currently still cottage food has to be delivered must be delivered in person by the CFP to the ultimate consumer. And license, nope, you can ship it if you need to. So those are your big differences between cottage food and licensed. Here are some examples, more examples of cottage food, acidified and acidic, home canned and home processed foods. These are all of our produce farmers online that could be doing all of those. You also have baked goods. These are all coming in under the cottage food exemption. I cannot stress enough how people should be bookmarking that page on cottage food, on the Minnesota Cottage Food Producers Association's webpage, where you have all those documents that are guidance. That is, I link to those all the time. We just send people right there. They're not all inclusive, right? And they're not a legal document, but they are super good guidance. Where I do think we need to update them is to begin to include more names of other cultures. Like I would say a fruit-filled biscuit is a kolache, because I got Bohemian and Czech in my background, but I'm guessing a Brazilian might call it something else and a Hmong might call it something else. And we should have those words available so those folks can all say, oh, really? I could be doing this under cottage food. I'd be making that. Yeah, you could. They're just written, you know, in our language. We just need to broaden that a bit. These are all cottage foods, beverages, candy and confections, dried, dehydrated, roasted, frozen products, if frozen for quality, not food safety. Your icings, frostings, sugars, art toppings, jams, jellies, all of these, right, are cottage food. And get to that list is critical. That is the one thing that we need to negotiate with both the University of Minnesota and with all of the MnSCU colleges and with the MDA. All of those institutions need to be linking to this document, because that is a big hole right now when we train new cottage food producers. You go through MDA's training, but you still don't know what the heck all the foods are. And it isn't until I entertain 52 million calls a year, and Shelly and Jen and Karen do another 52 million, right? I mean, it's just crazy that we make people jump through all these hoops. Let's get this document linked. You can just say it's a link to a document to an external source. Yep, that's what it is. And let's help people out. Let's meet people where they are. Okay, that was a little bit of soapbox, but still. All right. So can we do hemp? Yeah, you can do hemp. As long as they're the 3 products that are designated as generally recognized as safe, the grass. So you can do hulled hemp seeds, hemp seed protein powder, and hemp seed oil. These 3 products all come from the seed of the hemp plant and can be sold as food or added as ingredients to foods and sold in Minnesota. Again, this is hemp, not THC, because THC is not a food. Are these hemp products? No CBD extracts, no CBD oil, no hemp flowers or hemp flower products. I did see one gorgeous and really cool smelling cut flower bouquet coming out of a farmer's market that had hemp flowers in it. I'm not sure that was legal, but I did see it. No hemp extracts, no PCR extracts, no THC extracts, nothing from hemp plant parts other than the seed. So hemp can do this, but not this. Cottage food prep treats. MDA is, I'm sure, very thankful we finally got this one into cottage food, right? Because otherwise it's all ended up in the MDA commercial feed department and they were groaning. So we added pet treats for dogs and cats. So treats are not defined in law, but food is. So treats are whatever food isn't. And pet is defined in law as dog and cat, which I was thankful because I didn't know how to do hamster and gerbil tree. I didn't know what would be legal there. So I'm glad we don't have to. The ingredients must be human food grade, right? Pet treats must be labeled in the same way as other cottage food, except the allergen list is not required for pet treats because there's really no good source. And many pets are allergic to many different things. That is why that ingredient list is super critical on pets, right? So other pet treat exemptions, you can do so this is not under cottage food. This would be under the other law. So there's another law that's coming from the Association of American Feed Control Officials, coming in rules in 1510 and in 1540. and a lot of farmers have these on hand, like I butcher livestock, right? So I've got chews and bones and toys and exercises made out of animal hide. I've got hooves and ears and snouts. I've got bones and ligaments. I do not have pizzles or bully sticks. I have no idea why anybody ever thought that was a good idea, but they did. So if you want the source, you get to this page. This is where we link to. We send everybody here, not to put any burden on the Minnesota Cottage Food Producer Association's board, but this is critical that this is available to all of us in the industry. They also have a long list of that. It has the non-potentially hazardous foods for humans and for pets. Now, cottage food can be a stepping stone to licensed food production. So if you're beginning to hit that 78,000 or 78,000 times 2, if there's 2 of you that are licensed together in the same setup, or if you're just not set up to do this safely, let's say you got too many cats in your kitchen, then you might want to become licensed. And there's a whole session on that. So we're going to do a quiz right now, and you're going to come up with the solutions for us. So the first question is, I'm a farmer. So now we're going to say the difference between product of the farm and cottage food. First one is, I'm a farmer. I do maple syrup. I don't have a sugar shack that meets CGMPs. What's my solution?
So this is Cindy. CGMPs are suggestions.
Current?
They're not required, right?
No, if we're to do a sugar shack, your shack would have to meet current good manufacturing practices.
Okay, so that is in law because that was unclear.
Yep, that would
Okay.
be a requirement. And now, again, for a sugar shack, you could have open walls, right? Because you're boiling off all of that moisture. So that's critical. You would not want to do that in your home kitchen because, oh my goodness, you'd have sugar dripping from every ceiling lamp. But, and because you have to bottle it, right? How are you going to bottle it? So if I don't have that, how am I going to make this work? So I can't come under product of the farm because I don't really have the CGMP. So where can I do this bottling that I can legally then sell it? I feel like that teacher in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right?
Bueller.
Bueller? It's got an answer. Do you know what you're going to do there? As a farmer, if I don't have a nice CGMP facility, I'm going to bottle that maple syrup in my home kitchen and I'm going to sell it as a cottage food.
Yep, that's what Gail put in. Kathy, it's okay for people to unmute and respond, correct? I think that people don't think they can, so.
Yes.
And I don't want to answer everything, not that I would know everything.
You're right, that's perfect. You're just going to come in now. So remember, product of the farm means you could sell it to the grocery store, but if you're going to do it in your home kitchen, now your cottage foods, you're going to hit that, you know, just directly to your home, your individual consumer. Okay. Same thing with honey. Unmute and talk. Go ahead. Just say, you know, like, hi, I'm Gail, and here's your answer. I'm a farmer. I got, 20 beehives. I got a whole bunch of honey. Don't really have a CGMP facility. Oh, and I want to add cinnamon to my honey. I want to sell cinnamon infused honey. What's my solution here?
Cottage food,
Good job.
because you're adulterating the honey.
Yep. You're just going to come under cottage food. Again, you're going to have the limitations on sales cap, right? You're going to have a limitation on direct to end consumer, but you can sell up to $78,000 worth of cinnamon honey. Okay. All right. Farmer with herbs. I'm an herb farmer. Got a lot of herbs. I'm going to dry them, but I don't really have a good facility that meets CGMPs. I don't have a fancy dancy greenhouse or packing shed that I'm going to be able to dry all those herbs. What's my solution?
CFP.
Yeah, you're going to be a cottage food producer. You can dehydrate those all in your home kitchen in your home dehydrator and sell them under cottage food. Because now, and this is where we get to, you can't mix exclusions and exemptions. So this is what in my little head, I said, ooh, I'm a farmer. I'm just going to bring my herbs into my home kitchen and dehydrate them and sell them as product of the farm. So I wanted both the exclusion from the farm and the exemption of cottage food, and you can't do that. You can't mix and match. So you're going to have to sell those as cottage food. What about number 4? I'm a farmer. I dehydrate the liver from my sheep for my dog treats. It's 100% product of the farm. What's my solution there?
Couldn't sell it.
I'm going to come in here under this, the choose. I can do that under 1510. So there's no added ingredients. I can do it there, but I think that's the only place you can do it.
As a cottage food producer, then you can't add anything.
No, not under cottage food. You can only do it that 1510 exemption. Isn't that weird? Because there's another one out there that we could grab.
Huh.
Okay, I'm a farmer. I'm sorry, Shell, do you have any other questions there?
No, it's just, I can understand why people get very confused.
Oh my goodness, right? All right, I'm a farmer and I sell a produce CSA. So a CSA, for those of you, it's a community supported ag. You grow a bunch of produce and every week your customers get, a basket of produce. I buy farmers from another farmer to add to the CSA. Because my potatoes, I can't. They get eaten by the bugs every year, blah, blah, blah. What's my solution here? I'm
Not
buying
cottage
potatoes.
food, because you can't have somebody reselling your product.
Yeah, it's a license, right? That is a license. You are going to have, so our farmer CSAs that are bringing in product from some other farmer, they are going to have to go get a retail food handler license. And they'll stick the word mobile in there if they're doing drop sites. That license is $77. It is, and they're already set up. So it's for traceability. And it works to the farmer's advantage to get that license, because what if it's the potatoes in that box that cause the foodborne illness? Right? We'd want to know where those potatoes came from so we can solve that problem. Otherwise, both farmers are going to get sued. They're both going to have liability here. But if you would have that license, that's where your traceability comes in. So now I'm a farmer. I also am a registered cottage food producer. And so I've got my CSA box of 32 vegetables in there, and I'm going to throw in 1 loaf of bread. What do you think?
That should be fine to do a
Good job.
CFP.
Yeah, you're right. You're done. That's
As long as it's your own bread.
Yes, correct. Because you're a registered cottage food producer, you made the loaf of bread and you put it in your CSA box that only has your product of the farm. That box is perfectly fine. No license needed. However, we see this one a lot too.
Hey,
Now the
Kathy,
farmer-
can I stop you there?
You bet.
Yeah,
So this is Cindy. This comes up in Duluth quite a bit. So people different farms come together, they're putting together a CSA box. They want to include, the individual producer is a cottage food producer. They want to include one of their cottage foods in this box, but they're not physically at the place where the customer picks up the box. Yes or no? Allowed or not?
You are in number 7 because we see this a lot.
Oh, sorry, I didn't read. I'm sorry.
No,
But-
Cindy, number 7 is that next step, because we all get pretty creative. We say, okay, we're all going to collaborate here. I'm the farmer. I'm going to collaborate with another cottage food producer, and I'm going to add 1 dozen cookies to my CSA box. I have an on-farm pickup and drop-off sites. This combination is legal in 1 instance. If the cottage food producer is on the farm when people pick up, that would be legal, because then that cottage food producer is there to hand it to the ultimate consumer. But you can't put those dozen cookies in a box and at your drop-off sites, because then you're not there. Okay.
I have a question for you, Kathy. Let's go
Yes.
back to number 6.
Yep.
Because I was talking with Catherine Simons about a whole CFP who also had their food handlers. So you have product at the farm, which is separate from CFP. And while I agree that farmer and CFP could sell both, from my conversation that I had with Catherine one time, the consumer needs to know specifically that they're separate. So there has to be some separation. So you could have that box full of all that produce or whatever else the product of the farm is. But I'm wondering if that bread would have to be separately placed on top of that box, because when I was talking to her about a farmer's market for somebody,
Yeah.
That food
But different-
retailer handler had to have everything separate so they knew what they were buying separately. So there had to be a clear distinction at their table. And that
You
was.
probably have to sell them separately.
Here,
But
no,
not-
no, what you're getting at, if I could type, what you're
Yeah,
getting at there, what you're getting at there is a licensed product versus unlicensed. In this case, in number 6, the farmer is excluded. As a cottage food producer, she's exempted. So they can all sit in one box because they're all not under a license. But
They're all excluded. Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you for
yeah.
clarification.
But at a farmer's market, so we have this happen on many of them. You will have a cottage food producer that is also has a brick and mortar license. So Martha can bring in at her table, she can have her quiches under her license on the left-hand side of her table, and she can have her unlicensed cottage food on the right side. The key there is that that table has got to have a clear delineation that these are under inspection, these are not. Now, do the food inspectors like that? No, but the law allows it, and therefore it is on us, our industry, to do some self-policing here, right? Let's follow the rules and just make sure that your customers know these were made under license, these were not under inspection. That's the difference. This is legal. And that's why that example works, Jen, because both of them are
And
unlicensed.
if you want to make it even a little more confusing, should we really confuse everybody? We have CFPs that make barbecue sauce under
Yep.
their CFP registration. They also hold a wholesale license or retail license, and they have a commercial kitchen where they produce that same stuff, exact same recipe, but just at a different location.
Yep.
They can sell both of those at the farmers markets too, but they have to have that clear line separating them, but it's the exact same thing,
Yep,
just made in
correct.
2 different locations. So
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
that's
When
where
you
it was.
When you
I
get
just
into
wanted
the
to talk about
licensing world, we had a lot of vendors show up at Feast because they typically make things for wholesale markets. They had a wholesale license, but now they got to Feast, which is like a big old farmer's market. Now they were selling it retail, and now that license didn't hold. And for the first time ever, they had to go get that license, and they didn't know, and it caused a wee bit of angst. Everybody's totally confused now, right? That's okay. We're on the home stretch. I hope you're all drinking your tea or whatever your beverage of. Anyway. Okay, so we did the quiz. Very good, folks. So you can see how it gets kind of food farmers kind of can dance, right? If I can't get it in under product of the farm. I mean, you still start with, we need to stay safe. Remember, for those of us who sell directly to consumers, if we get somebody sick, we're going to know them. We're going to know that grandma. We're going to know that 3-year-old. We're going to know our people because we are in the direct marketing world. So we always start with food safety. But then, because not all the laws are written for food safety, some of them are just cobbled together for whatever reason to protect business interests, whatever. So then let's always start with food safety, and then let's figure out the rules. So you cannot mix exclusions and exemptions for a single product. You would want to, but you can't. You have to meet all the conditions of the exclusion or the exemption in order to claim it. With this, there's always an exception, folks. You can do a product of the farm and the exemption for the sampling and the demonstration, and you can do the exemption of cottage food and the exemption for sampling and food. That's the one combination you can do. Otherwise, you can't mix and match. Okay. So now we're into this is good. Good timing, folks. So now if we're done with product of the farm, no license, and we're done with exemption, the cottage food exemption from licensing. Let's say that individual farmers or others want to get a license from ag or from ag or health. So an individual farmer, if you're going to sell food you don't grow on your own cultivated and occupied land, or if you need to add an off-farm ingredient, salt, you're going to get a license. And again, remember that license means, this is in here. This is put in here. What about donated food? So we went from this particular screen is out of order. Remember, we talked about what if food is donated. Remember that sell means donated, offered, exposed. So donated food has to follow those exemptions, exclusions, and licensing. Again, what if food is donated? Remember that cottage food, remember the first year we put in 2015, we figured out, we made one tiny little error. we said that because the way it was written that you couldn't donate. So we went back in 2016 and made that amendment that yes, cottage food can be donated to a fundraiser bake sale. Here are other donated foods you can do. Venison can be donated to a food bank, food shelf, but that's an exclusion. Traditional Native American foods, including wild game, can be donated to a public facility, and wild game can be donated to a registered charitable organizations. These things can happen without a license, but they are specifically called out in law. Otherwise, you can't. Again, what if food is donated? So other than those specific examples, food that is donated must be eligible to be sold. So it has to be an approved source under license. So not approved sources. Cottage food is not an approved source. Can't be sold into commerce. Custom exempt meat, poultry, rabbit. No. On-farm processed poultry and rabbit. No. Shelled eggs that aren't candle graded labeled. No. Wild harvested wild game and food made in approved home, private home. None of these are called approved sources. So they cannot enter into the public food stream that's in commerce. So these are the ones that couldn't go into a grocery store or a hospital or a school. Products sold by others in the farmer itself. So the community supported agriculture in which one farm buys from another separate farms or from other separate farms to fill their CSA boxes, that would require a license. Farmers market hubs. So we've got 9 farmers market hubs in the state of Minnesota. They are licensed food hubs. So they're either got a retail license or a wholesale. They can only sell on their hub platform licensed food products. So all of our farmers, those 9 farmers markets at our food hubs, they have a lot of cottage food producers. So in order to do that legally on their online platform, they're going to say Jen's Cookies. And they'll list them as $0. And then in the description, it says, you're going to meet Jen at the market and pay her directly. You can still order online. So you get all your pre-orders in okay. And you can make that sale, but the money exchange has to happen between that customer and Jen. And Jen has to walk those cookies out. The market cannot do that for her. So these are just little things. You can still expand your market, right? And still do it legally. Other food hubs and co-ops, same thing. You have to make sure they're approved source and the broker and distribution sales. You will need a license if you're going to add any off-farm ingredients. So if a farmer wants to do bakery products, flavored honey or maple syrup, pickle salsas, fermented products, jams. If you want to keep that, you will have to do a license or you're coming in if they're legal under cottage food. And again, THC edibles are not food. We have a lot so cross-border sales, we have a lot of folks, right, that sell into Minnesota from other states. And so you must follow the laws in both states when selling across the border. So if you're in Minnesota, you follow Minnesota rules. If you want to go to Wisconsin, you have to follow Wisconsin rules. Same thing with Wisconsin coming our way. Some products are covered by federal law, so in those cases, there will be consistency from state to state, but if they're state laws, there's not going to be a lot of consistency. Federal law says raw, whole produce can cross state borders without a license. Raw, whole. You couldn't cut the cabbage in half because that's not whole, but a whole produce you could. And USDA inspected meat, poultry, and rabbit can cross state borders. Not Minnesota equal to, not custom exempt. So if you need to have a meat cross a state line, you got to have it butchered in a USDA inspected meat. Licensed food can cross state borders if you register with FDA. For instance, canned, acidic, or acidified cottage food produced products cannot cross state borders for 2 reasons. Number one, you would have to first register with FDA, but we literally wrote it into the law. And that's why it's possible that this is a little bit in the weeds. With FSMA, remember that rule, the law that got changed in 2011, the FSMA Food Safety Modernization Act. If FSMA, and it's not quite done yet, it was written in 2011 and some pieces are not yet finalized because there's so much to it. If in FSMA, they redefine the word kitchen, then it's possible that FDA, that restriction on FDA with canned, acidic, or acidified would not exist. And then we would want to change our Minnesota cottage food law because that restriction on FDA side would go away. So we need to pay attention to the FDA, to how FSMA is defining that word home kitchen. Because we wrote it into the law. So right now, if FDA changes their mind, our law still says, no, you can't, because we literally wrote it into the law. We were following FDA, but if FDA changes its ruling, then we could legally change ours. But right now, there's two reasons why these can't. So you can imagine our poor out-of-staters, they can bring the same Wisconsin vendor can bring her baked breads across the line, but that jam and jelly, she gets to keep it on the other side, or that salsa. So that it's awkward for those farmers markets or anybody crossing that state line. So cross-border sales of the state's processed produce with no added ingredients, that actually varies by state. So Minnesota says that's just product of the farm, no license needed. In Wisconsin, they say, yeah, if you want to cut that cabbage in half, in Minnesota, product of the farm, you can do it. In Wisconsin, nope, that requires a license because you just cut that cabbage in half. In North Dakota, cottage food and product and that cut cabbage cannot cross the border. So you have to follow, I see I'm missing a word there. You have to follow regulations in both states. North Dakota is really restrictive for their food producers. I feel sorry for them because you can't go either way up there. And we've got one farmers market food hub that is on the border taking product from North Dakota and Minnesota. That, I mean, to keep track of those laws is a little bit crazy. So if we're going to cross borders, can baked or dry cottage food products cross the state borders if both states allow it? Yep. And high sugar jam, jellies, syrups can cross state borders if both states allow it. Minnesota says yes. Wisconsin only looks at pH, so that wouldn't apply to them. And North Dakota says no. And we don't know enough yet about Iowa and South Dakota. That's still on our list to kind of figure out, because we need to help out everybody in those parts of the state. We're going to go through water really quickly. Kind of really refers more to rural people. If you're going to have a rural food business, your water source has to be a, quote, approved water supply. And that means if you are in rural Minnesota, your private well has to be constructed to the well code. That was put into place in 1974. So if your well was dug after 1974, your well digger was required by law to submit the plans that he or she did to dig your well. If your well was legal at that time, and you'll have an index out there on the well site, you got rules. If your well is here in the middle, your well can be 3 feet away from your house, but good gosh, if you've got a liquid manure storage without a liner, it's got to be 300 feet from your well. That would be a great idea. You really don't want manure in your drinking water well. If you go to something called the Minnesota Well Index on the Minnesota Department of Health's website, and you type in your address like I typed in mine, you're going to find out that my well was dug sometime apparently before Christ was born. We don't know. Just it's out there somewhere. It's a good well. I test it every year. We got great water. But because my well doesn't show up on their map, if I want to have an on-farm thingy, I would have to bring in a food truck that has its own water source. I have to bring in bottled water for people to drink, and I have to bring in water from a approved source. So, you're going to go to town and get it out of those, even to wash the hands at my porta potties. Now I can go, I see the little green arrow here to the left. If I go to my neighbors, I can hold everything I wanted to at my neighbor's farm, because when you click on hers, it shows up. This is what it's going to happen. If you've got an approved well, it'll have a well index number. It'll tell you how deep it was, blah, blah, blah. So if you want to have anything in rural Minnesota, because if you're doing your stuff in town, you are on municipal water. So you are an approved source. It may be in worse shape than my water, but it doesn't matter. The law says, right? So just keep that in mind. So what if your private well doesn't pass muster for a food license? You bring in your own water, you hire a food truck, you hold your event at your farm, at your neighbor's place so that you can have an approval, or you literally have to install a new well. So just keep that in mind for water. So now we're just going to quickly touch on food and beverage service. So these would be, if you're a cottage food producer that now decides, no, I want to get out of cottage food, I want to start selling tacos. That would be food and beverage service. And that all of that legislation comes under Minnesota Department of Health. They call it food, pools, and lodging, comes under the food and beverage and lodging establishments. All of your requirements, they are going to be under 157. And then if you go to 157.22, that's where your 15 exemptions lie. Yep, there they are, the 15. So in 157 is what is a potluck? Do you need a license to have a potluck? No, you don't. But it has to match all of these requirements in there. It has to be private, blah, blah, blah. Do you need a license under 157 to serve food at a church? Nope, you don't. That would be the church lady law. That's an exemption in subdivisions 2 and 12. Do you need a license for weddings, funerals, fellowship, meals? Again, these are all food and beverage service. So MDH, all food really starts in ag. Ag's got to approve everything. And then those ingredients that are approved, they flow into what health legislates, and health legislates then anything that you're going to be eating, like ready to eat, ready to drink. That's what health does. And so all of these are exempted. You don't need a license. You have to follow a certain kind of some other exemptions, but you don't need a license. They made an adjustment in 1995 that caused issues. So in 2012, they came back and amended it that said an exemption was added to allow faith-based communities to serve food at fundraisers or community events, as long as it's on that grounds or in the building of that faith-based community. Touched it again in 2021 so that you could do pickup because a lot of, during COVID, a lot of the faith-based organizations were helping out with COVID feeding. So that's an exemption in there. There are exemptions in 157 for all your fraternal, sportsmen, patriotic organizations. So cottage food, remember, is an exemption from licensing, but there are like 25 exemptions or exclusions. We are one of them. Universities and colleges that have their own processes in place don't have to have a license. This one came in with the safe food sampling in 2014. When a group up there said, we want to have soup and chili cook-offs without a license. You can do that as long as you follow some requirements. Interestingly, the language in that statute specifically says soup or chili. Don't know why. I mean, you can't have cookies. Apparently you can't have, just soup and chili. But they haven't really defined soup or chili. So stew, would stew work? We don't know. And then the one they did in 2019, many people call it the lemonade food stand law. It is the food stand exemption. This one, I wish they would have also inserted, but you got to take some kind of food safety, right? I think it's one of the few ones that doesn't mandate. I think it's the only exemption on the books that does not mandate some kind of food safety or food safety service training. Has to be less than $1,000 per year. You do have to operate it as a special event or seasonal temporary food stand. You could only do it between 10 or 21 days. It has to be on private property. There's no restrictions though here on type of food. The food does not need to be approved source. It can be potentially hazardous. And if it is, you have to have a sign that says these products are sold at this stand are not subject to state inspection or regulation. One that I saw was they got raw milk from their neighbor and they made raw milk homemade ice cream, and they could do that legally under this. That would be a relatively risky as far as food safety goes. So in that case, they were really food safe smart, but that would be legal under this exemption because there's no restriction on type of food. I wish this one would have said, and you need to take some kind of food safety training, just like we did with cottage food, right? Okay. So if you need a license, you may also need to employ or become a certified food protection manager. That person is responsible for ensuring the food safety in your food and beverage service operation. They can train other people. And then if they're not going to be there, they have to appoint. So that has to be written down in your SOPs that someone is going to be that person in charge. And there must always be a person in charge if that business is open and operating. CFPMs are not required for low-risk food establishments. That's a terminology in the Department of Health. They're not required if you're just a special event food stand, or if you're a retail food vehicle, portable structure, or cart, or if you're an establishment with very limited types of food handling. How do you become a CFPM? You take a training class and pass an approved exam. You get your certificate, you send an application, that certificate and $35 to the Department of Health. If you take the CFPM, you may hear this one that we have done battle with the people that put on those trainings. Some of those trainings say in their courses that are approved by the Department of Health that local food is not an approved source. That is absolutely incorrect. Local food is an approved source. Product of the farm is approved. But unfortunately, too many school districts heard this. So as now we're pumping in more money to have more school districts buy directly from farmers, they pull out that old fact sheet that says, we can't buy directly from farmers. Completely wrong. Yes, you can. It's an approved source. So we are working with the Department of Health to get that language cleared up. So the one thing that on the farmers market side that we look at, many times people will send me this certificate as if that was their cottage food registration. And it's nothing to do with it, right? A certified food protection manager certificate is not a food license. It's just a training certificate if you need it for health. So CFPM does not equal CFP. They are not related. And if you remember when we first passed that cottage food law, many people said, oh, so if we have that training, are we good to go for cottage food? No, because cottage food is completely different. The requirements and limitations and the training is completely different. In fact, we will train you to cook some foods under the CFPM that you would not be allowed to cook under cottage food, right? Because they're going to teach you how to cook fish and meat. Well, you can't do that under cottage food. So keep that in mind. They're completely different. That training does not substitute for our training. So you have to take the cottage food producer training in particular. Any questions there? So that all just pertains to ready to eat food and drink. Jen, you okay?
Hey, Kathy, I'm just going to interject for a second. Just so you know, you have about 10 more minutes.
Yeah, we're in good shape.
Okay, I
So
just wanted
now-
to make sure.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that because I think, 189 total slides. We'll go fast. Jurisdiction. So who's in charge of what in Minnesota? Here's how it breaks down. Ag's in charge of all product sales. Health only is in charge of food and beverage service. Ag is in charge of all food and manufacturing. Ag is in charge of all food handling, of buying and selling of packaged foods. Anytime you package it, you're under Ag. Farmers' sales of their own farm products, that's all Ag. Ag's in charge of other food that doesn't fall under the Department of Health, like meat slaughtering and processing, dairy production. Ag takes care of all of that. The Department of Health only takes care of food beverage service, preparing and serving foods to individuals. But that means that, and that's all in 157. And that means, though, that they are in charge of all the restaurants. So think of any time that you're eating out, restaurants, schools, churches, assisted living facilities. Anytime that you are serving food, a grocery store that has a deli, Health would be in charge of that deli because that is food ready to eat. Ag would be in charge of everything else in that grocery store. And that leads us to this. There are many entities that in one location would be under both Ag and Health. And so in Minnesota, they have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, that if 51% of your sales are under Ag, you get the Ag license. You have to follow the requirements of the health license, but you wouldn't have to get that. It's per, and this, catch that, it's per location. So you get one food license, either Ag or Health, per location, per legal entity. What if you have two locations? That's another license. If you said, oh, Kathy Zeman's going to be in charge of the manufacturing, Kathy Zeman plus Jen is going to be in charge of, or let's say Kathy Zeman LLC is in charge of the manufacturing, Kathy Zeman Inc. is in charge of serving it. Two different entities, that's another license. So it's per location, per entity. So a farmer or a food maker operating at multiple locations may need multiple licenses, and that really trips up a lot of us. 51% rule is the majority of dollar sales by an entity at a location determines that license type. The rule applies to the licenses, not the facilities and not the processes. So it doesn't matter which license you get, you always need the appropriate equipment and process for what you're doing. So what gets kind of confusing then when you get into licenses, look at the names of the MDH licenses. Sorry, these are Department of Health licenses. Special event, food cart, seasonal temp, seasonal permanent, food truck, right? Now look at the MDA license, retail food handler, mobile food handler, wholesale food handler, wholesale food. And then the custom exempt meat processing, that's a brand new category in 2021. What do they cost? They're cheap. The cheapest thing you're going to get is your license. It's your kitchen, right? That'll have to be decked out to match the product that you're selling. In MDH, it does go by food establishment. They do it by risk category, and both MDA and MDH charge you a review fee. So if you, for many of their license types, not for your special event food stands, but for the other ones, and that's because they're going to ask you a whole bunch of questions to figure out what your place looks like, what you're really going to do. And if it's kind of simple, it can be up less than $250, but if it's kind of, you might pay an additional $500 for that plan review for H. Ag starts out at $77, pretty cheap here, right? These are the lowest rates. Ags increase as your annual revenue sales increase. Those are self-reported. Ag does additional one-time plan reviews for retail licenses, and they charge you $200 to $425, and that's based on square footage of your facility. This is not helpful if you're a farmer's market manager. They all expire on different dates. So on January 1, you may have all of your vendors legal, but by March 31st, if this person didn't remember to renew, they're not legal. On June 30th, if these folks didn't renew, they're not legal. And then fortunately, cottage food goes to December 31, which helps out everybody a lot. At least it goes January through December. So to get started with MDA licensing, you go to Jody Burke. She is your food liaison. There's a request form. Use that. It helps her kind of sort out. If you get stuck, if you start getting stuck between cottage food, between product of the farm, between licensing, you're going to, and it's all easy because look at Ag has their rules, Health has their rules. Ag has 7 delegated authorities. Health has 40 some. They all interpret things differently. It gets to be chaotic. Particularly, these are your delegated authorities, particularly if you are a vendor selling underneath different delegated authorities, they're all going to have different rules and regs. To find out if you are under a delegated authority for health, you're going to run out to this map. The dark blue ones mean they have their that's fully local. The medium blue, they're partial. And if you're light blue, you just go to state. So I'm lucky in Rice County where I live, I just go to state. I only have to obey one set of rules. So that would be really the least amount of regulations. We do remember that there are 11 tribal nations within the state Minnesota boundaries, and that we interact with them a lot in how we sell. Ag has 8 delegated authorities, but only for retail. That helps out a lot, so you don't have to have a lot of interaction there. MDA, what I like about how MDA rules were written, their delegated authorities cannot be more restricted than MDA. The state food code is a minimum and maximum code for MDA. It does not exist in health. Mobile vendors, an MDA license is good statewide. MDH doesn't have that provision. Counties and cities with DAs can require a mobile vendor to purchase another license. And they are delegated authorities in Hennepin, Ramsey County, cities of Minneapolis, Minnetonka, the University of Minnesota. Kind of gets a little bit awkward there. This is a little bit in the weeds here, but we're in good shape. 2 minutes. All of these things, by the way, licensed food establishments can make, but they do require a HACCP. So if I'm a restaurant, I can make my own cheese. I can make my own yogurt, even though typically that'd be under PMO, you have to have a HACCP there. We're not going to do these scenarios. We're going to say, if you get stuck, you're going to come to FIT. You're going to get FIT. You come to the Food Innovation Team. It's a subcommittee under the governor's task force for food safety and defense. A bunch of us sit on there. Shelley and I do. I'm the chair this year. And so since I'm the chair and Jane, the former chair, and Brett's on this, if you get stuck in this world, you can come to any of us and we will try to help you get unstuck. And it is 2:28. Any questions? This is the short 2-hour version. The long 4-hour version, we go into a little bit more depth and more things. It gets even more confusing.
Thanks for taking the time to go through all this with us, Kathy.
It is kind of fascinating, right?
It's a lot
Very
to think
interesting.
about.
All right, folks, good luck. Good luck with your food making and Predict the Farm stuff. And we'll see you either in your community event or at your home or on the internet or at a farmer's market selling your good cottage foods.
And Kathy will be doing another training like this in February and in March. And you'll be able to see it in the events on our website. And you'll be seeing it in on the farmer's market website.
The 28th. So if you're a vendor of either of our organizations, you're free. Otherwise, it's $10, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So, yep. So make sure you are a member of the Cottage Food Producers Association and you get to come free. All right. Good luck, folks.
Thanks, Kathy.
Kathy.